As the protests continue in Iraq, Prime Minister Adil Abdul Mahdi has pledged reforms in a bid to pacify angry protesters. The Iraqi government has announced a series of measures and reforms in an effort to restore peace on the ground. The announcements were made after a special overnight cabinet session that was called for in light of the anti-government protests. The cabinet has made and issued a decree including 17 planned reforms. They cover areas such as land distribution and increased welfare stipends for those in need. To address the rising unemployment rates, the government has spoken about creating large market complexes and increasing government benefits for those without work. The government has officially designated those killed in the protest as martyrs and granted special benefits to their families. The Iraqi Human Rights Commission has put the death toll at 99, while almost 4,000 people have been injured since the protests kicked off on Tuesday. They've been on for more than 5 days now. Meanwhile, the United Nations has also taken note of the situation and condemned the violence. The UN's head of the assistance mission for Iraq has called upon all parties to pause and reflect and to hold people accountable for the reported deaths. And those protests in Iraq are taking place more than 3,000 kilometers away from India. But the question is, should New Delhi be worried? Iraq houses a considerable number of Indian nationals. As per the reports, there are currently somewhere between 15,000 to 17,000 Indians living in Iraq. Most of the Indians are employed with steel mills and oil companies. The Karbala oil refinery alone employs close to 6,000 Indian nationals. Apart from the Indian nationals residing in Iraq, another 30,000 Indians visit Iraq annually on pilgrimages. While the Indian government has still now issued no travel advisory to Iraq, keeping the situation in the country in mind, there is as of now no travel advisory, but the prospect is very much on the cards. If a travel advisory is indeed issued, it will not be a first. In February this year, the Indian government had advised its citizens to avoid travelling to 5 Iraqi provinces. These 5 provinces are the ones which remain the worst affected by terrorism and incidents of violence. In case an Indian citizen has to travel to any other part of Iraq, even then they have to register themselves with the Indian government and inform the Indian embassy in Iraq. Let's broaden this up and delve into the multiple facets involved. Joining us on the broadcast this minute is Sanjay Kapoor, editor of the Hard News magazine. Also joining us is Kadira Pethiyagoda, non-resident fellow, Brookings Doha Center. The research there focusing on India's relations with the Gulf state as far as Kadira's work is associated. Thanks very much, both of you, for joining us here on WION World is the One. Let me begin by asking you, Mr. Kapoor, how concerned should India be given that the situation in Iraq continues to remain tense?
I think India has to be concerned, reasonably concerned for what is going wrong in Iraq. Not just because Indians are there in numbers, not so much as they used to be in the past, but also because it's a major oil supplier, and especially after the sanctions that have been imposed on Iran, and there's no supply of any oil from Iran. And Saudi Arabia recently has been hit; their refinery has been hit by Houthi or unidentified missile or drone attack. So I think we need to watch it very, very closely, and because any kind of turbulence there impacts us. We have historical ties with Baghdad, and it goes back to thousands of years. In fact, it's, if you read the memoirs of there, so India is quite at the center of happenings in Baghdad and Iraq. So India should be watching it very closely.
Right. We'll just try and reconnect that line with Mr. Kapoor. But as he's telling us, there remains considerable concern as far as the situation on the ground in Iraq is concerned, and also given the sense that we have been getting in as far as the Indian nationals are concerned there. Kadira, let me come to you on that aspect. What's your sense of what the immediate priorities should be for countries like India that have a sizable number of nationals there in Iraq?
Yes, and sorry, just before I start, I should clarify, I'm no longer with the Brookings Doha Centre. I'm now with the Geneva Centre for Security Policy.
Right.
So in terms of the immediate priorities, I think it's a good question because immediately, India has to worry about its migrant workers, not just in Iraq, but in the region, because knowing the Middle East, conflict and instability in one country can very easily spill over into its neighbours. And given that, Iraq is a very central country in the Middle East in sort of its connections with both Iran as well as the other Arab states, as well as the Gulf Arab states. It's quite an important country for India to keep watch on. Like the other guests said, oil supplies is another major issue for India. When you compare India to other great powers and other rising powers like the United States and China, as a proportion of its energy usage, India, you could argue, is the most reliant on Middle Eastern energy. So any increase in the instability in that region has important implications for India. But I would add that in the long term, this again goes back to the point that India needs to engage beyond economics and beyond migrant workers with the Middle East. It needs to engage more in a strategic and security fashion so that we kind of, firstly, so prevent these kind of, help to prevent these kind of instability occurring, but also to be on the front foot more when it does.
Right. Stay with me, Kadira, and also Mr. Kapoor. I'll just come back to you both. The mass protests, of course, are something that contemporary Iraq has witnessed in multiple phases. Just in the last one decade, in fact, Iran has witnessed almost a dozen mass protests with multiple casualties. A look now at some of those uprisings and why this theme is a recurring one. If we take you back to the year 2011, when the Arab Spring was at its peak, Iraq has witnessed its share of tensions back then. Of course, even though the then Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki had announced that he would eliminate term limits, protesters did not buy that narrative. They remained unconvinced. They took to the streets in large numbers in February 2011, and the resultant clashes took the lives of 45 people. There were simultaneous protests against the Saudi intervention in Bahrain and also in Iraqi Kurdistan for greater autonomy. Let's take you now 1 year forward to December 2012, when mass protests broke out following a raid at the Finance Minister Rafi al-Isawi's office. Al-Isawi was a Sunni, and the root cause this time around was sectarianism. The Sunni Arabs felt marginalized in post-Saddam Iraq, and that triggered the unrest. Fast forward then to 2015, and once again the economy and corruption took center stage. The protest started in Baghdad and spread to other cities in southern Iraq. This particular protest had a template quite similar to the one that's ongoing right now. Even Iraq's top cleric, Grand Ayatollah Ali al-Sistani, called on Prime Minister al-Abadi to take a tough stance against corruption. On the 15th of July 2018, central and southern Iraq witnessed a slew of agitations. The main reason at that point was the general lack of progress and development. Protesters blockaded the country's border with Kuwait and occupied several oil fields. The protest was so fierce that Iraq had to redeploy forces that were engaged in fighting the Islamic State. Iraq's history of mass protests stands testimony to the socio-economic situation and the crisis there. While the government raises billions of dollars through oil export, the money is seldom spent in a way that reaches the people, actually trickles down to those in need. And that has resulted in poverty, high unemployment rates, and triggered social unrest on multiple occasions. Going back across now to Kadira, You've been studying the situation in Iraq for many, many years now. Help us better understand the underlying issues like we just discussed. Many have said that Iraq's high dependence on oil is a major concern and one of the reasons why we are witnessing what we're witnessing on the ground as of now. And several statistics telling us that it could take as many as 5 years for Iraq to actually reduce that heavy reliance on oil. Why is that such an important concern here?
Yes, I guess in that sense, Iraq suffers from what they call the natural resource curse, where countries that are heavily reliant on natural resource exporting for their economies end up facing some significant challenges as there's unlike, for example, if it had a manufacturing economy where there would be a lot of value add and more jobs, the extraction of natural resources can lead to inequality and skewed development. I guess when you look at Iraq, you have to look back to the colonial era when the current borders were drawn, which then put together several different groups and different identities, whether Shia and Sunni or Kurdish and Arab, and it's been challenging to keep a coherent state in the midst of all that. And I guess the biggest, in the last couple of decades, the biggest disruption was the invasion by the Bush administration of Iraq, which was an incredibly destructive foreign policy decision, which exacerbated certain tensions that obviously had also been exacerbated by the rule of Saddam Hussein, but sort of opened the box and then led to the birth of ISIS and destructive forces that destabilized the entire Middle East. I think one of the interesting things about this protest is the economic focus, and it also reflects, I guess, what happened with Iraq during the elections, where we saw some parties like the Communist Party performing well, and I think that it may be indicative of a return to, I guess, the kinds of revolutionary or ideological movements that may have been around in the 50s. Because so in the last few decades, the only sort of revolutionary language in the Middle East, or the most dominant one, was that of Islamic fundamentalism, including because of it had foreign funding and support.
Right.
But prior to that, there were economic and more left-wing kind of movements. And you might see that in a country that had been secular like Iraq for many years. You may see that kind of thing re-emerging as well.
Right. Mr. Kapoor, do you concur? And what do you make of the slew of reforms and measures that have been announced by the leaders there just over the last few hours? Do you see those steps cutting any ice and pacifying the protesters on ground at all?
People have been very angry over the way the entire society has been devastated past 10, 15 years. They have shed so much of blood and they haven't seen stability return despite the United States of America promising democracy will change their lives. And after what we saw was one event after another, then you had the Islamic State taking over Mosul. So there is no guarantee. I mean, if you look at it, Iraq is a fairly wealthy country, the 5th largest oil producer. They should have had no problem. They don't need money from outside. I mean, they say that in a matter of 2 years, the oil revenue alone can take care of their needs. But you see how badly it has been treated by the people in power. And not just that, I mean, there are too many external agencies. You have external powers which are meddling around with Iraq. It really hasn't settled down. All the time this government is trying to somehow ensure that there is a balance between Iran and the US. Now they've opened up one border post with Syria. So that is also being questioned both by the US as well as Israel. And then recently there was also an attack by unidentified drones which blew up the the festivity of the Shabi, the People's Mobilization Unit, and that causes a great amount of unease. So you may announce whatever you need to. Jobs are not going to come back till the time there is peace and stability. And till the time that happens, you have people agitating. Look at the rate of unemployment. 25% is really huge. I've been hearing voices coming out from Iraq. People say there is no need for us to study at all, because at the end of the day, you don't get any job. And, and on top of that, the people who get elected, they are losing faith in parliamentary democracy. They keep repeating time and again that this is a democracy only meant to fund themselves, and they have nothing to do with people. And this is a voice which hasn't really found echo and resonance in other Arab countries also. Somewhere it is not showing up because the rulers are very oppressive. In Iraq, they have begun to do it because you have some kind of democracy. So that is the reason why we hear so much. But look at the brutality. In a matter of a few days, 100 people have been killed. You have snipers also taking pot shot. So I'm not very sure it's going to die down very easy. There will be more blood which will be spilled on the roads of Baghdad and Najaf and other places.
All right, I think that does adequately summarize some of the immediate priorities as far as the leadership on the ground is concerned, and where India's concerns also lie here. We're going to leave it there for the moment. Mr. Kapoor and Kadira, appreciate very much you joining us on the broadcast with those perspectives.